Um, to kind of get started, this is what we're going to be talking about today. So, as I said before, my role with veterans is not as a clinician, but as a documentarian, even though I am a licensed counselor in North Carolina. And I'm a counselor educator at Walden University. And I've been in the field. I completed my master's degree at Wake Forest in 1998. So, I've been in the field for a long time. But this work in particular has been from a different perspective. And I think it's allowed me to have conversations and insight I wouldn't have had if I had approached as a clinician. Not to say one's better than the other, it's just a different angle. I just want to say that I'm sharing this with you from that point of view, and I'll say more about that in a little bit. But these are the main things I want to cover today. Some of the broader cultural concepts that are foreign to civilians, some of the issues that may be lying underneath the surface for combat veterans, and how ultimately, as civilians in particular, and some of you may be veterans yourselves or be related to veterans, but for me as a civilian, how I've been able to effectively make really significant and important and profound connections with veterans from many different age groups and combat eras, and how I feel like I've been successful in helping them to open up and really share intimate and personal stories with me. So we're going to talk about that. Um, a lot of the information I'm going to talk about, I want to give credit early on and frequently, come from two sources. One is Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, which if you're interested in trauma at all, you've probably already read. If you haven't read, I highly recommend it. It's a great book. I'll have this on the last slide of the presentation as well. The other one is the work of a woman named Deborah Grassman, who served as the hospice coordinator for the VA for a long time. She has books out. She has a wonderful website. It's called Opus Peace, and that's OPUSPEACE. That's the approach that she takes with veterans who are dying. And her work is amazing. And again, her name is Deborah Grassman. So I recommend both of those folks' work as sort of a starting point if you are interested in learning more after. And I say that now in case I go too long again and my resources page gets cut off. I want to give you those early. Okay, so this quote for me really sums up what we're going to be talking about today. All wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. And so for combat veterans, the experience they've been through, even if they weren't on the front lines, even if they were never injured or like primarily in harm's way, they carry with them memories and stories and experiences and losses that people who have not been in combat simply have no frame of reference for. And so no matter how long folks have been away from a combat situation, they truly carry those memories and those thoughts with them in a very visceral way, in a bodily way, and it's tied up with intellect, emotion, and sort of their physical experience in the world. For many folks, especially as you all know with PTSD, it's not just a remembering, but a reliving of the experience. And so I just find this quote a really solid framework for the way we start to approach our work with veterans who have seen combat. My interest in this subject started here. This is my grandfather. His name was John Briggs, and he died in 2004, and he served in World War II. And I grew up knowing that he had been in the war. He was drafted later in life. He was about 30 years old when he was drafted. My dad was a baby. So my grandfather was married, had a child, and was an established professional. And he was drafted in 1943 and went to Europe in the fall of 1944, where he joined the 3rd Armored Division, and he was part of a crew on a tank. And part of his job was reconnaissance. And so they would go out in front of the troops and look for the enemy, look for Nazis. So it was an incredibly dangerous duty assignment. He was in extremely heavy combat. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, which is the largest land offensive ever in the Army. He's one of the first American troops into Germany, and he served throughout Germany at the end of the war, when it was basically street fighting and man-to-man fighting. And so he was a part of all of that. And yet, as a child, the way I knew him was this. I mean, you can look at this guy's face. I mean, he was a delight. He was a complete charmer. He was very funny. He was a light in the world. Like, I never saw him in a bad mood the whole time I knew him. And yet he carried these really significant trauma memories with him. And toward the very end of his life, he started opening up to people about what he had seen and experienced, but not to me, not to the immediate family. He would tell like my distant cousins or the minister. But he didn't want to talk about it with family. And this is a picture of him. I flashed it real quick, but this is him with his crew. This is my grandfather right here, second from the left. And when I first saw this picture, I was like, what? Like you can see there's a cigarette in his fingers. I never knew him to smoke. These swords and rifles, if you blow them up, there's actually swastikas on the handles because they had collected these as souvenirs. And when we found his things after he died, he had a whole cigar box full of Nazi pens and medals. Americans are notorious souvenir takers, and he had brought these things home, and it begged the question, how did he get them? Who did he take them from? Where did they come from? And so I felt like this mystery had been opened up to me about this person I thought I knew, but had this really incredible experience that I knew nothing about. And I wanted to learn more about it. So that's when I began interviewing combat veterans from World War II. And word started getting around that there was this incredibly nosy girl with a tape recorder who wanted to hear stories. So people started calling me from different eras. I started attending veterans events, which is a way, by the way, I highly recommend to start building connection with veterans is go to where they are and be there. And don't be there as a therapist, but be there as a human being and really sit down and have coffee and listen to them. The more I showed up, the more I started gaining trust, and people started asking me to come to their homes and record their story for them. All the stories are in a local oral history museum, and I make a copy for the veteran. And I've had family members after the veteran died call me and say, thank you. I have this thing for him. You know, I have his voice forever, or have her voice forever, because I do interview female veterans as well. So that's how I got started in this work. I've interviewed to date about 110 veterans. The past 2 years, it's obviously slowed down. I've done a couple interviews, but being with typically older people who are not very healthy is not the greatest way to spend your time during COVID. So I've really stepped back from it. I do hope as things start opening up, I can start going to events again and seeing my buddies, but it's been a while. I'm going to take a quick pause. I want to just ask you all real quick. You know, I've told you a little bit of my family story. I think a lot of times people come to this talk because they have a personal connection to veterans. So I just want to check in. Why are you here? Why did you choose this presentation? And is there someone in your life who you have that personal connection to that you feel like is sort of compelling you to be a little bit more engaged with this kind of work? And you can just
I can go. My dad was in the Marine Corps. My fiance was in the Marine Corps. I work with veterans at a substance abuse facility. So they're in, I see them every single day, but just hearing their stories from somebody that was in for 20 years compared to somebody that was only in 4, it's the same kind of like PTSD type of trauma. And it's crazy like how much it's affected just the one that's been in for 4 years compared to the 20 years. It's, you know, maybe more, but it's still a significant impact. And it's weird that I had one veteran had told me he was in for 20 years. He was kind of making fun of the guys that had been in for 4 years. He was like, they don't know what PTSD is. I was like, whoa, they do. So it's intriguing to kind of see that dynamic.
Crystal, that's a great point. So one thing we're going to talk about, I'm not going to get real deep into diagnostic stuff just because it's just beyond the scope of what we have time for today, but we are going to touch on it and why that situation of someone who maybe spent 2 or 3 years in Afghanistan may be far more traumatized by someone who spent 20 years in the military and why that is. And so we're going to talk about that just a little bit. If you have other comments, feel free to toss them up in the chat too. I see oh gosh, we have a lot of good stuff here.
I was just going to pop in and say in undergrad, I did a study on logotherapy and I conducted a research study. It hasn't been published yet, but particularly the use of logotherapy in veterans. And I have to say, I just kind of fell in love with that population after I started to realize like how Frankel, you know, this whole theory could actually be used in that population. And then in my grad work, I'm realizing that like I'm now trying to figure out kind of what my professional orientation is within theories, but just realizing my passion for wanting to continue to work with this population. So
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, Jesse. And looking at the chat, there's a lot of folks that have family relationships. We have veterans, we have family veterans, and to vets and family members of vets, thank you for your sacrifice and your service. The families of veterans don't get nearly enough attention. So if you're interested in this topic, please think about researching that and presenting on that yourselves. We need more support for those folks. A lot of folks who work with veterans already, or who, my mailman just showed up, so the dog's gonna bark. Okay. And also folks who are in private practice who serve the military. So just wanting to kind of enhance your awareness of those needs. I think these are fantastic. I really appreciate you all being here. Goodness gracious. Okay. So I like starting with this framework of sort of the warrior virtues and what are some of the broader cultural pieces of being in the military. So I'll let you all read these. You're capable of that. But these are some of the virtues that we really assign to the military in the United States. And it's really important to note that we have a very specific military culture in the US that is very different from most places in the world. We have the largest military in the world, and we are not by any stretch the largest country in the world. But we have the largest and the most well-funded military. We have, in fact, the military industrial complex that Eisenhower cautioned against when he left the presidency. He really didn't want to see that happen, but that's what we have. And so in the United States, we have a very specific kind of perspective on the military. And the military has a very specific set of cultural norms that's actually pretty consistent across cultures. And a lot of these archetypes come from like Jungian psychotherapy. These are kind of the archetypes that we assign with someone who is a warrior, someone who's a fighter. So if you're a mom and you're fighting with the school board to get services for your kid with special needs, you're also embodying the warrior virtues. So it's not just for people who are in the military. But we can look at these virtues and see the benefit of them, the strengths of them. And for a lot of us, we want to embody these virtues in our own lives as well. And for people in the military, oops, sorry about that. For people in the military, there's a sense of connection to these virtues that goes far above and beyond what we experience as civilians. We are aware of it, but it's less a part of our daily vernacular. And this is a letter from Eisenhower to the troops on D-Day. And I absolutely love the tone of this letter. We don't write like this anymore. But I'm going to read the last couple of paragraphs for you, just so you can kind of hear it as well as read it. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. I mean, I get chills every time I read it, and I've read it 1,000 times. And if I were following someone into battle, this is the kind of person I'd want to follow, because these are the warrior virtues. This is someone who clearly sees, why are we laying down our lives for a cause? It's because the ideal is so important, it is worth dying for. It's a powerful statement, and it's a powerful tribute to those virtues. But of course, if you're Jungian, you know there's a shadow to every virtue. And so these are some of the warrior shadow pieces that can really manifest, especially when we're counseling combat veterans, because a part of that culture is we don't talk about our pain. We don't talk about what's happening on the inside of the machine. And so stoicism. When combat veterans have either voluntarily or felt compelled to engage in behaviors like killing for the sake of killing, disregarding morality and ethics, behaving in a mercenary fashion, that's when the moral piece of it starts to get corrupted. We saw this in Vietnam, and that was, such a horrible, when bad things happen, it happened in a really big way, because we were talking about teenagers who were in an impossible situation, and who perhaps weren't getting the mentorship and the guidance that they needed, and they broke from those warrior virtues into that shadow place. And so if a soldier or a veteran has been in a situation where they felt like they had to compromise their moral standing, some of that can manifest in sort of an internal injury that you may not see right away. Real quick, let's go down our little history lesson. This is where I could spend 5 hours, and I'm going to do it real quick. In fact, I'm not even going to look at my notes because I have far too many notes. But I start with World War II, even though our World War II veterans are leaving us, and you know, World War II vets are now in their mid 90s and older. So this is a very small population. But World War II really set the stage in the United States for the culture that we still attribute to the military, which is why I talk about it. It was a good war, air quotes. It had a clear moral purpose, it had a clear beginning, it had a clear end. It was a decisive victory. And 16 million Americans served in the war. About 400,000 died. But if you think about those millions of people coming home in 1945, 1945, 46, um, they all had a common language about what they'd been through. They all had a common purpose. So like if you were struggling, you could go to your neighbor's house and have a beer and kind of talk about it, even if it was in sort of a casual way. So there was a real sense of community purpose, and there were people all around you who understood what you had been through. So combat veterans really had a built-in support system. It's not to say they didn't struggle, but there was a sense of commonality about it, and the culture was behind it. People were at home playing their victory gardens and collecting rubber for the troops or whatever. So there was a real unity around this war that didn't exist in wars that came after. And as I said, this is the war that really set us up in our own minds as being sort of this virtuous liberator of oppressed peoples, which later on became a bit more corrupted as politics got involved, and certainly wasn't perfect in World War II. But we remember it sort of as this really perfect example of why war is sometimes necessary. So the Korean War came shortly after, and it's often called the Forgotten War. And it was very different because everybody was exhausted by war. They didn't want to talk about it anymore. It was in this place where the names didn't make any sense, and we didn't have like the same level of connection to it. You know, a lot of people in the United States are from European countries. So we understood Germany, but we don't get Korea. Like, can we even find Korea on a map? And so for a lot of people, this felt very distant. Korea was never called a war, it was called a police action. So a lot of Korean vets don't feel like they were ever fully validated for what they went through. The conditions were very harsh, it was extremely cold. And the United States did not decisively win it. In fact, a Korean vet told me about a retreat. One time they were retreating, this massive retreat back over the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. And he said it was just absolute chaos, and it was the most horrifying experience of his life. And so we kind of underestimate the level of trauma many of those vets experienced, many of whom had also served in World War II and were already pretty exhausted from combat. We could do a whole presentation just about the Vietnam War, which was until Afghanistan, our longest war. It was about 20 years. Of course, again, we did not win it. This was a war that we lost. We withdrew, but there was no winning. This was also a war that sort of got corrupted by political ambition. I think it was 4 presidents that oversaw this war. Correct me if I'm wrong. And you know, there was a sense of just passing the buck from president to president. And really early on, behind the scenes, people were beginning to suspect that this was not winnable, but no one was willing to step away from it. So they just kept throwing troops at it. And this is a really good example of how veterans from Vietnam began to feel abandoned by their government. They felt abandoned by their people, and they started to have that sense of moral corruption because what they were doing, they didn't feel like was really valued by the people around them. And it was a really challenging experience for them. Really quick, to drive a point home about trauma, I want to do a little poll with you. So I want to ask you what you think the percentage of people who discharge their weapons in these 3 conflicts would be. So let's start with World War II. So thinking about the Army in particular, what percentage of armed troops do you feel probably shot their guns or discharged their weapon at some point during World War II? So just type a percentage in the chat and let's see what you come up with. Okay, so I've got 15%. Bill Stewart's read the book. Crystal's wrote 30. Princessa, that's a beautiful name. We're at 20. Laurel wrote 60%. Chelsea, thank you for your honesty. I didn't either have a confident guess. You can see the answers are pretty broad, 25%. Good guess, Jesse. The answer is actually 15 to 20%. And so what that means is 80 to 85% of troops never even shot their gun. So one thing about World War II, it was a war fought at a distance oftentimes. So it was fought by planes with bombing. It was fought on battleships offshore. So there wasn't so much of the intimate nature of it for every member of the military. So maybe they were in combat, but they perhaps never fired their weapon. Okay, Korea, I'm going to give you this one. Korea saw a 55% discharge rate of their weapons. So now we're looking at a war where people are much more kind of intimately involved, and they are personally responsible for the act of killing or attempting to kill. So what are your guesses for Vietnam? What do you feel like the discharge rate would be for Vietnam? Crystal says 80. That's a good guess. 75, 85, 75, 60%, 60. It is, according to the book I read, which I'll tell you about at the end, it's actually 90%. And so again, we're looking at a situation where almost every person who served in Vietnam discharged their weapon at one point. One of the veterans I interviewed was a Seabee, so he was in the Navy and he was in the construction battalion, which doesn't really sound like a job where you would shoot your gun, and he discharged his weapon. So it was very common. It was much more up close and personal. Children were being used as weapons. So a lot of times they had to make the choice to kill a child. So there are a lot of things happening in Vietnam that were particularly traumatic to a human spirit. And that's just really important to understand as the military has evolved. One more quick point that I think is really interesting and tragic. When my grandfather was practicing target shooting before the war, he shot at a target. So it was like a round target, like the Target logo for the store. As training techniques evolved, the target was replaced with a human-like form, including something like a literal melon for a head. So when you shot it, it blew apart. So that when you killed somebody, you weren't in shock by how it looked. They wanted to desensitize people before they sent them into combat so they would be prepared for the reality of it. So if you've already been desensitized and now you go into combat and you're more apt to pull the trigger on your gun, you're also more apt to be traumatized by that over that long-term period. So there's just so much to this that results and supports the manifestation and development of trauma. So this handsome group, and this is Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, which officially ended in 2014. And of course, we just withdrew last fall and from Afghanistan in not a way that resulted in very good outcome, not trying to get political, but that was a really difficult situation. And I found this, sorry about the pixelation, I found this graphic that the kind of the connection to Vietnam was this sense of we left people behind. And a lot of Vietnam veterans felt that so many of the South Vietnamese that were helping them just got left behind. And so that is a moral injury to have these comrades and these supporters, translators, assistants, spies, like people that were supporting the effort that got left behind, and who knows what happens to them. That's really hard for veterans. And so kind of that same sense of like, what did I do it for? A lot of these Afghan vets are struggling with those same questions. And just to put it out there, I think Vietnam veterans can be very helpful in their healing as they have someone to talk about who has that same experience. Okay, so let's talk a bit about military culture. What I'm going to do next, now I'm going to look at my notes. Okay, I want to show a few slides. These are just pictures I pulled off the internet, you could find anywhere, but they all struck me as having a particular feel to them. So as you look at these pictures, and I'll show one and then wait a few seconds and go to the next, just type in the chat, what are some feelings, thoughts, perceptions that came up for you as you look at these images? So here's the first one. And again, forgive the pixelation. Here's the next one. I see exhaustion, Vietnam. Thank you, Bill. Exactly right. Brotherhood and sisterhood. Great, Sharon. Here's the next one. Women in combat, Black soldiers on the front line. Thank you, Crystal. Babies. Oh, totally. It's heartbreaking. Carrying a lot. Here's the next one. Boot. Yep. Boot camp. Breakdown, grit, fear, and violence. These are great. Strong Marines, absolutely. Desensitizing, absolutely. The same thing. Crystal and Kelly, it's the same thing. A strong Marine is desensitized to some degree. Gosh, which just reminds me of a story. Sorry about this, but that piece, a long time ago when I was much fitter, I ran the Marine Corps Marathon. And if you've ever run a marathon or run a long distance event, it's really freaking hard. And I was exhausted and I got to the end of it. I mean, my feet hurt. I could barely walk. And when you get to the end, one of the Marines kneels down and takes off the little, there's like a microchip they put on your shoe to track your progress. So this Marine knelt down and took off my microchip and tied my shoe and then patted my foot in the sweetest way. And I just burst into tears. And so there is a sense of that strong Marine desensitizing, dehumanizing, and they are still human and they still feel that love and that care and that affection. And so we have to understand that balance within them and that tension within them, that they are being desensitized to go into combat to protect us because they care about us, right? It's a very interesting dichotomy. And again, it is nothing that civilians ever have to experience, which is why it's so powerful and so unique. And I think, Jesse, to your point, why we get really interested in it. It's why I'm kind of obsessed with it. I want to understand it better because it's such a mystery to me.
Dr. Briggs, this picture reminds me of something my son shared in a letter from boot camp in Marine Corps.
Yeah.
And he actually got in trouble. His way of coping with stuff sometimes is humor. And so his drill sergeant was in his face like this, yelling and screaming at all of them. And he got in trouble for getting tickled. So he started giggling and getting tickled at the idea of somebody shouting in his face like that and got in trouble as a consequence.
I bet he did. Oh my gosh. Well, and it's interesting because as counselors, imagine this is a classroom. Would we ever see this? No, I mean, I hope not. I hope you never went through this. But the way we're trained as counselors is so contrary to how service members are trained. And the ideals and the techniques are so different. And so we're really, unless we start to understand the culture and learn about the culture, there's going to be a chasm that's hard to overcome. This is a quick clip from Full Metal Jacket. It's the Rifleman's Creed that's read by the Marines. So I'm going to play this just to kind of put the cap on that conversation.
Good night, ladies. Good night, sir. Hit it, sweetheart. Sir, aye, aye, sir.
We'll overlook the misogyny in that last little bit for now, but so that's the actual Rifleman's Creeds that the Marines learn. I have I was looking for it to show you, but I have actually the book, a training book from the Marine Corps that has that creed in it. And the first time I read it, I was like, wow, this is quite a thing to live with and to live as sort of an embodiment of your work in the world. Okay, so we're going to talk briefly about combat stress injury. Again, this is where I'm going to go real fast. I just want to give you some general information. Each of these topics could be a presentation on its own, but these are some of the primary things that we see in combat veterans. And in saying this, I want to say something else too. One of my dear friends is a Vietnam veteran, and he is the coordinator of many of the veterans events, and he knows I give these kind of talks. And he always asks me to say to you all, please remind people that the vast majority of us are just normal people trying to go about our lives. We're not all traumatized. And he gets really frustrated because people tend to see veterans as heroes or victims, and there's nothing in between. He was like, I went to Vietnam, I did my job, I came home, and he's like, and I think the statistics are about 80% of us are fine. So don't assume that a combat veteran has trauma, just as you wouldn't assume that a rape victim has PTSD or that someone with addiction has PTSD. You know, we really want to assess for that and make sure. That being said, especially with these younger veterans who have been in these really intense combat situations, who have served multiple deployments in a war that was not won, and a war from which they were in the desert and then 24 hours later sitting in a living room at home, who had very little time to decompress and really try and understand their experience, and who are much more likely to survive their injuries than in the past. So they're much more likely to have a traumatic brain injury or something similar. We just want to make sure that we are assessing people properly. We're assessing for mental health, substance use, and brain injury diagnoses, and we're not missing anything. So that's a big part of our work, is making sure we're really listening and paying attention, but that we are effectively assessing for the whole person and not making assumptions. This is just a real quick overview of PTSD. I am more than happy to share this with you. If you'd like it, send me a message. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth about it, but one point I want to make as you look at this slide is that PTSD for combat veterans is different from anything that will happen with civilians, because the trauma is constant, it's repetitive, it is like a daily part of their existence, and it happens on multiple fronts. And so they might be traumatized by a physical injury or being up close and personal in combat. They might be traumatized by the smell of rotting flesh if they're in a zone where there's been a lot of death. They might be traumatized by noises, such as the repercussion of a shell. They might be traumatized by visual experiences. Again, they might be traumatized by a moral injury or a more of a soul injury. And so there's a lot of different ways that can happen for combat veterans. Again, very different from PTSD in someone who's been, say, a victim of violence one time as a civilian. So that's just something to know. You know, gaining experience, gaining knowledge about those specifics can really benefit your clients. Long, lots of text, not going to go over it all because we're already running out of time, and I knew this would happen. I've talked about most of this stuff, but just understanding in particular the level of emotional suppression that combat veterans utilize to stay focused, to stay clear when they are in combat so they can protect themselves and so they can protect others. That emotional suppression doesn't turn off the second they come home. It is something they can continue doing to cope, and it ultimately can be a harmful coping mechanism if it's overused. And Crystal said, if I curl my hair, my dad doesn't like the smell because he was in combat. Exactly. It can be something as small as that, something we would not even think of. But that smell in particular can be really ingrained for them. There's a book I'll recommend at the very end that talks about some of those sensory experiences that combat veterans struggle with. This is a little bit more about moral injury. I've talked about this quite a bit, but sort of this sense of unmourned grief for the loss of self, the loss of friends, the loss of innocence. A lot of veterans lose their religion. A lot of veterans find it when they're in combat. But that sense of betrayal, that they've been betrayed by their country or by their platoon leader or by their family or whatever. all of that can lead to a sense of emptiness and disconnection that can exacerbate some of their combat experiences. And I want to share with you a couple of stories from my oral history experience. If I can get it go. Okay. This is the first one. And I think I skipped a slide. Let me check. Yes. So when we're talking about combat experience, there's really three ways that it manifests. And of course, there's a range within these three ways. And the first is the person that has successfully integrated that experience, and they're very at peace. There's a sort of a it's like anyone who's gone through trauma and grown from it. It's that post-traumatic growth that we love to see as therapists. But there's just a sense of they understand why it happened and they've integrated into their lives in a really healthy way. The peers integrated is probably the majority. It's people who, are doing pretty well in life, but it's always sort of in the background, and small things can trigger an overly strong reaction. And they may start to experience bigger problems as they near the end of life, or they start to weaken, and mentally they start to weaken. And then the not integrated is folks who have this lifelong PTSD. They feel like they lost their soul in the war, and they may have experiences with active addiction that just never go away. And that's can be very challenging, kind of that lifelong struggle for them and their families. This is an experience, an example of someone I know, Ron, who is a Vietnam veteran. I think this is such a beautiful transcript of how it feels to be in the war and how he split himself in order to survive. So I'll read it quickly. When I grew up, everyone called me Ronnie. Ronnie died in Vietnam. In the military, everyone called me by my last name or by my first name, which was James. Eventually, I settled on Jim. When I came home, everyone still called me Ronnie. They couldn't understand that Ronnie was gone. I started to introduce myself as Ron. Jim was the guy who went to war. James was the strong one. Ronnie was a little scrawny runt. Ron was the man who was trying to make a life. When I'd struggle with my memories of Vietnam, I'd remind myself those things happened to James, to Jim. It was a coping thing. Ron is the most amazing person, as you can see from this. This is an example of kind of appearing integrated. This was a World War II vet I interviewed, and he was suffering from dementia. And this clip is about a minute, and it is from literally the first minute of our interview. And you can hear right away kind of the level of trauma he's experiencing. And he was about 90 years old when I interviewed him. Tell us what branch of service you were in?
I was in the 2087 Special Combat Battalion. We landed in France, HR-2. And our destination was Saint-Merglis at all costs. So we were 1,800 men, and 900 was only me. So it was a rough tussle. But like I say, I don't want to be judged for what I done. This is what I had to do.
I mean, you can hear the emotion he still carried 70 years after his experiences in the war, and the pain and the guilt and the shame he continued to carry, and that he was ready to put down. He was ready to talk about it. This last one is Larry. He's a great example of someone who has integrated their experience, and just one of the most beautiful people I know.
I've met some incredible people, truly incredible people that I think influenced me on so many levels, on maybe decency, respect, honor, truthfulness. You know, do what you can do. You know, you got a team behind you, or people will help you get it done. And not many situations bother me anymore. You know, we'll work it out. It'll work out. So the value is, I mean, it's indescribable, really, because it's part of who I am.
So you can hear, I mean, everything about Larry is just, this is who I am. This is a part of what I went through. It's who made me. And this is not Larry. This is Robert Duvall in Apocalypse Now. I need to say that. He would be very embarrassed if you thought that was him. But he was in the 1st Cavalry Division, which wore this hat. So he actually had one of those hats, and he flew a helicopter. He flew one of the Cobra helicopters that was basically artillery in flight. And he says what saved him is the last 3 months of his year in Vietnam, he flew medevac and he got to save people. And he said it was the smartest thing his commanding officer ever did, because he got to have that 3 months to do good things before he came home, and he was able to integrate his experience much better because of that. So a lot of what's on these several pages, I typically give this information to nurses or people who don't have counseling training. So a lot of this is something that you all already know about because you're trained as therapists. The biggest thing I'm going to point out with this is that being sincere is so important. And I have asked veterans, like, can you help me understand why you felt comfortable opening up to me? And they said, I believed you. I believed you were sincere. I sensed you were just here for us and you weren't here for yourself. So the more sincere you can be about that interest, about that curiosity, Jesse mentioned it early on, that just bring that passion to your work and show up as your whole self, and they will really resonate with that. Veterans, especially combat veterans, can smell a lie a mile away. So just be as sincere as you can. Things like, I also found like things like photographs or images or referencing another veteran. I knew a veteran who experienced this. Is that something you've experienced? Really helps them to open up. You don't necessarily need to have to come in everything through the front door. Using those side doors can really help start conversation. Some languaging. First of all, I don't have this on this slide, but make sure you're using the right language. So a soldier is the Army, a Marine is a Marine. Don't call a Marine a soldier. A seaman is the Navy, an airman is the Air Force. So just make sure you're using the right language. Not everybody is a soldier and they don't want to be called that. So you need to know the identity that they're coming in with. And you don't have to know the full language, but just understanding a little bit about some of the lingo can really help them understand that you're there and you have some knowledge and you're trying to get them. And if you screw up, just admit it and apologize for it and ask them to help you understand them better. It's okay if you make a mistake. Dangerous duty assignment is a little more inclusive than combat. For example, Kosovo was not a war, but it was a dangerous duty assignment. And so there are situations where combat veterans have seen really intense things, but they don't officially call it a war. So it's helpful to use that language. You all, again, you know this, don't use platitudes. A lot of times people will say, well, you're such a hero. Thank you so much for your service. And veterans don't like that. I'll be honest with you. Most veterans don't want to be thanked for their service. They feel really uncomfortable about it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that if that's something that you do naturally, but just realize not everybody will receive that in the way that you intend it. And it's because for them, it's not about themselves. It's about the group. It's about the unit. And in their minds, if they're here and their friends are not, it's not something to be proud of. So we just want to be careful about how we're showing up as civilians, and we're not saying things that may actually feel alienating to them, even if they're very well intentioned. Okay, so 2 minutes over, it's 1:47. So we have a few minutes for questions or comments. You can throw them up in the chat, or if you want to take yourself off mute and ask a question, we can certainly talk for a few minutes. And I'm going to put up my references in case we get cut off. So you can see those. And that's my email, but you can connect me in the Whova app. These are my references.